Hey One World Entertainment and Star Trek, a legacy that has lasted 60 years. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the past, the present, and what the future holds for this franchise. Because, of course, the future was expected to be under Alex Kurtzman, and that seemingly has come to a screeching halt, thanks to Paramount and David Ellison saying, yeah, no, we're good, thanks, see ya. Moving on. So, Star Trek, of course, the original series, debuted in 1966. And of course, it was something never seen before. An exploration journey with a crew made up of everybody, all walks of life, and all equal. Nobody was under somebody else in terms of, oh, you are lower class than we are. There was none of that. Everybody was equal. And of course, the groundbreaking moment of having a black woman on the bridge as an equal. Also in command, you had a Japanese man at the helm, you had a Russian brought in, you had a Scotsman over in the corner, and of course you had a Vulcan, an alien species, standing right there as your first officer. And they explored new worlds and new civilizations on a 5-year journey. The stories that came out of the show were fantastic, well-structured, human stories, people stories, with exploration around it and all the science and sci-fi elements as well. But it never overtook the human story. But the show only went for 3 seasons. Now, that wasn't because the show was a disaster or people just weren't watching it. It's because Paramount didn't have all that much faith in it, or I should say CBS. They tried to pull the plug after the first season, but of course the campaign from fans pushed it to get that second, and then they wanted to cancel it again, and campaigns once again forced the studio to continue, and they gave them 3 seasons. But then they pulled the plug. Now, they didn't pull the plug in terms of Gene Roddenberry knew that they were going to pull the plug, because the show pretty much ended with an episode that clearly they thought they were getting a season 4. But CBS had different ideas and pulled the plug. Now, Star Trek really grew its fan base and grew to the prominence it has through reruns. Once the reruns started, this thing took off and became a cult classic. And then of course the animated series came around. And then of course there was conversations about Phase 2. But Phase 2 fell apart and it became the motion picture. And they moved Star Trek to the big screen, thanks largely in part to Star Wars. That they went, hey, if we could do something like that, but with our brand, we're golden. And Star Trek became a big screen franchise for the next few years, obviously starting with the motion picture, which did well at the box office but wasn't received all that well. And of course they went, that's because the people that were running it didn't quite understand what Star Trek is and should be. And they went back to the drawing board and brought in people from the show to do the next movie, and of course the rest is history when we got the Wrath of Khan. But then of course 1987 came about, and what happened? We got Star Trek The Next Generation. Not just where we introduced to a new crew and a new ship, we were introduced to a new timeline. And what I mean by timeline isn't it was a parallel time. It was we jumped from the 23rd century to the 24th century. We were now on the Enterprise D, this gigantic galaxy-class starship that once she came down on that first shot, you were like, what the hell is this thing? And then, of course, you're introduced to Jean-Luc Picard. And the big question, of course, was, can Star Trek work without Kirk and Spock? And it was on shaky ground at the start, but then season 2 happened, and it's still on shaky ground, but it started finding its footing, and then boom, season 3, and she just took off and ran for 7 seasons. But during those 7 seasons, we got to 1993, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine showed up. A very different, non-Gene Roddenberry style of Star Trek, because we were now introduced to a bit more of a darker tone, because we were now on board a Cardassian space station. And of course, it was the Federation being put in charge of this space station after the Bajorans rose up and won their freedom from the occupation of the Cardassians. And of course, we were introduced to Ben Sisko, and we were introduced to him on board his starship as it was getting destroyed at Wolf 359, where he lost his wife. And of course, his whole frustration and anger was directed right at Picard. And Picard is the one who gave him the assignment to be on DS9, and of course, you could see the friction between the two. Picard, of course, wasn't quite sure what the issue was, but it ends up being found out that it was because of Locutus and Wolf 359. But the show still was very Star Trek. Yes, the tone was a little different at the beginning, but it was still very Star Trek. You still had the exploration out there when they got the runabouts and start going through the wormhole and all this stuff, and all the other starships would show up, and then of course later on they got the Defiant. So it was still very much in vein of what Gene Roddenberry pictured. Just that this time we were on the end of things where wars had happened and we were seeing the aftermath of it. And then came 1995 and we got Voyager. And of course Voyager was a show that very much departed from what Star Trek was, because we were going to have a Federation starship lost in the Delta Quadrant, and it was going to take at least 75 years to get home. And this show very much was up and down. People weren't quite sure what way to take it. You could see where they were trying to go, but they would stumble every now and again. And then of course season 4 brought in Jerry Ryan as 7 of 9 to pretty much try and save the show, and it did. But it still is one of those shows that it's up and down. There's some great episodes in those first few seasons, but there's also some absolute stinkers in there. But overall, it was still a well enough received series and managed to go for more than 5 seasons. And then of course, we made it all the way to 2001. We were in the new millennia and Star Trek Enterprise came along. Now Star Trek Enterprise did something never done in the Star Trek franchise. It went backwards. We went back in time this time for a show set 150 years before the original series, with the first ever Warp 5 starship, of course named Enterprise, under the command of Jonathan Archer. Now, while this show was coming out, at the same time with DS9 was finishing up, while Voyager was out there and finishing up, we were getting the TNG movies. The original series movies had ended in 1992, I believe it was, when The Undiscovered Country came out. And then came 1994, where TNG ended its run with its 7th season and went directly into the movies with Generations. Then 96 came First Contact, 98 came Insurrection, and then there was the big gap. The big gap between 98 and 2003. So while Enterprise was airing, we got the final TNG movie, which was Nemesis. And Nemesis signaled the end of this iteration of Star Trek on the big screen, because it was not well received at all and did not perform at the box office. Enterprise at the same time had just been cancelled. Now, the guy who cancelled it because he hated Star Trek, and of course it was Les Wiseman or Newsman, whatever his name is. He pulled the plug finally. He finally saw his chance and took it and pulled the plug and killed Star Trek outright. And it was the end of Gene Roddenberry's vision. And that's important to say, because that from 1966 to 2005 was Gene Roddenberry's vision and Gene Roddenberry's version of Star Trek. And it was gone. And then came 2009. And J.J. Abrams walked in with Alex Kurtzman and Robert Orci, and they introduced Star Trek 09, a new take on the franchise. Once again, we were meeting Kirk and Spock for the first time. So we had now in the movies, we were going backwards. And it continued to not quite work the way they were expecting it to. Why? Because they were trying to make it for the general audience and not just Star Trek fans. Which meant you were pretty much alienating the Star Trek fans, because what you were giving them wasn't what they were expecting and used to. And then of course, those 3 movies, 09, Into Darkness and Beyond, didn't quite work at the box office. Yes, they looked like they earned money, but they actually didn't, for the amount that was put into them and the amount put into the promotion of them. They actually never worked, especially Star Trek Beyond in 2016, which absolutely tanked at the box office. That seemingly put the end of Star Trek on the big screen once again. But then, out of nowhere, Star Trek was coming back to the TV screen under Bryan Fuller, and it was going to be Star Trek Discovery. And he had pitched this idea. He had shown a concept of the ship, which was a reused version of the Phase 2 Enterprise. And people were like, okay, what is this? And again, we were told it was a prequel series set before Kirk and Spock. And people were like, okay, not so sure about that. But then the craziest thing happened. Alex Kurtzman usurped Bryan Fuller and got Bryan Fuller removed and took control. And ended up giving us the modern day Star Trek that we had. Kurtzman Trek. From Star Trek Discovery right up to now with Star Trek Starfleet Academy. And of course, none of it worked. As much as they'll try and tell you it did, none of it worked. No fan took to it. It was rejected outright. They just kept commissioning more and more and more. And of course, we had Discovery drop on Netflix to start with. And Netflix were furious and tried to get out of their deal. And they were told they can't. To which they were the first look for all new Star Trek. And they said, hell no to Star Trek Picard. Even though Patrick Stewart was coming back. Amazon were the ones who went, we'll take that. And then they received Picard and went, what the hell is this? And during all of this time, we had the licensees being fired because when they were handed the designs for Picard and of course Discovery, they went, we wouldn't be able to give this shit away. They were fired because of this. Even though the next group brought in said the exact same thing. And all of a sudden, we had a Star Trek that was now behind a paywall. It was the minimum of 8 episodes, maximum 10 episodes, but behind a paywall. And people, when they saw it, they went, this is not Gene Roddenberry's vision. It was dark. It was violent. It was swearing all over the place. There was a Klingon rape scene. There was Klingon babies, decapitated heads, eyeballs being ripped out, F-bombs being dropped here, there, and everywhere. Alcoholics here, there, and everywhere. Everybody all of a sudden was gay. It was just so un-Star Trek. And that is what modern Star Trek is. That is the present right now of Star Trek. Except it's finally being put out of its misery when David Ellison sat down with Alex Kurtzman and Akiva Goldsman as they pitched their next ambitions for Star Trek Year 1 and Star Trek Starfleet Academy Seasons 3, 4, 5 and God knows how many more, and their ideas for movies and stuff. And David Ellison went, no thank you, you're done, bye. And that brings us to Star Trek's future. What is Star Trek's future under David Ellison and this new regime at Paramount? Well, we know they have planned 2 movies. We have the movie from the 2 guys, what's his name, Goldstein and Davies, whatever their names are, that are supposedly going to introduce a brand new crew, a brand new timeline, a brand new ship, and have absolutely zero connection to anything that's come before, because they want to completely rebrand and relaunch Star Trek. However, the writing's already on the wall that may already be a failure, because they're already talking about these guys are the perfect ones to introduce the casual moviegoers to Star Trek. You already fail once you do that. Once you go, it's not about Star Trek, it's about trying to get the new audience, you've already failed. But they also have this other movie that we still don't know what it is and where it's going to be and what it's going to do. But the biggest issue right now is the fact that inside Paramount they're saying, yes, they know very much so they want to move forward with brand new Star Trek on the big screen. That they want Star Trek to be a massive tentpole franchise on the big screen. Problem is, they don't know what and how to do it. That's a big issue. Right now, I think the future for Star Trek is bright, but it needs to rest. It needs to be put to bed for the next 7 years at least, maybe even a decade, just to get the bad taste of Kurtzman Trek out of the mouth and go back and look at what Gene Roddenberry created and say, that is the direction we need to go in. Those are the type of stories we need to tell. That is how you fix and save Star Trek. So, its future right now, I think it's a bright future as long as it's taken the right way and done the right way. But that's my thoughts. What do you guys think? Where do you think the future lies with Star Trek? What do you think about the present with Star Trek? And what about the past? Let me know. And with that, I shall leave it there for this one. So do like and share and subscribe and all that good stuff. Cheers, and I'll catch you in the next one.